And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you're receiving this information. This is your show, Chisme is Life. Chisme is Life. It's all about sharing information and recognizing that the chismosa lady down the street or el chismoso down the street is not a bad thing, right? These are informed community members who may save your life someday. And so today we are here in Chisme is Live, and we have the privilege and opportunity to have a wonderful conversation with Yasmin Landa. I recently met Yasmin, and I really like the work that you're doing, Yasmin. And so I wanted to bring you onto the show and have a wonderful conversation about your past, your present, and your future. So let's chisme out a little bit. First of all, thank you for accepting our invitation to be here.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
Yes. And again, tell us a little bit about Yasmin. Where are you from? Were you born in this country? Were your parents immigrants? What's the deal with that so that people get to know you a little bit before we talk about the other pieces, like why does your screen have a logo of UC Berkeley and all, and this door that is so important for people at UC Berkeley. So tell us a little bit about who you are and your family, all of that stuff.
Of course, I'd love to, especially, given that my background has really informed a lot of what I do now. I was born and raised in Yakima, Washington. So, for those who don't know where Yakima, Washington is, it's about 2.5 hours away from Seattle. And it is a predominantly farm workers little city. And so my parents, moved there before I was born. And so they had been there for, I would say, I think over 25 years. And so my parents are actually both immigrants from Mexico. And so my dad is from Merida, and then for my mom is from Campeche. And so both of them, very hard workers, moved to the United States to find better opportunities for both myself and also for both of my older brothers. I think, a lot of who I am today is because of the sacrifices that they made to kind of give me these opportunities. So for additional context, my dad is from this very rural little place. Merida is like the closest city that he would like closest city to the place where he lives. And so that's why we always say he's from Merida. But in reality, he's from this small little rancho that they call Salinas. And so I actually had the pleasure, I was talking to you earlier that I had the pleasure to go visit recently. And, I think it was an incredibly impactful experience. And in that, and along with some of the stories that my parents would tell me, really got to experience what it was like to be born, my dad who was born and raised over there, but really what it was like to struggle to even put food on the table. And so, given that at the time my parents had recently gotten married and my older brother was actually born, they realized that they just simply did not have enough to be able to take care of for the little one. And so it was a really tough decision for them to leave home and also leave like the rest of the family behind. But they ultimately made the decision to move to the United States and made their way up to Yakima, Washington, where I was born.
It's definitely a long trip because you have to travel all through Mexico in order to get, and a lot of our people or immigrant refugee communities, they end up in LA, maybe Sacramento, maybe San Francisco, but then going 2 states over and making it all the way to Washington is a whole different experience in itself. And I think that is a good place to start in regards to why would somebody choose to leave their home, their family, their culture, and all of these pieces that make you who you are. Because for a lot of us, it's not just me, but it's my community, right? The
Mhm.
elders are the ones who pass on ancestral knowledge to us. And then again, grandma does or grandpa does the babysitting at times. And all of those pieces, especially in small ranchos where everybody knows everybody, everybody knows
Mhm.
everybody's chisme. Um, But at the same time, everybody supports everybody often. I
Yeah.
know that in my small village, everybody was my uncle and my aunt, meaning we had to treat them with that level of respect. They could correct your behavior, not through violence, but just letting you know that whatever you were doing was not appropriate. And suddenly, you leave everything behind out of necessity
Yep.
in order to come to a world where you might not even know anybody in the new community where you ended up. Um, and it's rare, and it does happen, that from time to time, almost a copy of the village where you're coming from moves slowly. One person moves to here, and they're like, oh, just come over, we'll support you. And
Yeah.
eventually you end up with almost a copy of the whole village. That happened here in Sonoma County in Petaluma, where if you go to Petaluma, the city of Petaluma, they have the equivalent of a copy of Tejas de Morelos, Oaxaca, because again, one person was going to Washington, interestingly enough, to work in the apple orchards, and he
Mhm.
ran out of money. And when he
Mhm.
ran out of money, he got a job in the egg business here in Petaluma. Petaluma used to be the egg capital of the world. And
Mhm.
so, as other people migrated from Tejas de Morelos, Oaxaca, they just stopped in Petaluma and slowly. Nobody went to Washington
Mhm.
anymore. Everybody stayed here, so I'm not sure if your experience with your parents was similar, where other members of the community where they come from ended up in Yakima, or if you ended up isolated, because sometimes
Mhm.
if you don't have other members of the community there, you may
Yeah.
live in an apartment where there are 200 families, but you
Mhm.
still don't know anybody. I'm not sure what your experience or your family's experience was like.
Yeah, it's very interesting that you mention all of that, particularly because when my parents first came to the United States, they did end up in being like stationing themselves for about a year in Los Angeles, where they eventually had actually my second brother. And from there, my dad's uncle actually had suggested that he move to Yakima, Washington. There was jobs for like in construction and painting that they did. And so from there, my parents actually made the decision to go over there. But it's interesting because my dad actually went first and he went to kind of scope it out to see if there was actually like job and if there was an opportunity for my mom to work as well. And so following that, he realized that there was. And so he then called my mom over with the rest of the family.
Mhm.
But what was interesting that you said was this piece about community. And so my dad had an uncle over there, and my mom had a friend who also moved over there. But I think there's this piece that really called to me, and it's the isolation piece, particularly because my dad had actually left the rest of the immediate family in Mexico, which means that I actually never really got to meet in person like my uncles and my aunts and my cousins until most recently. And so I think, I think about that isolation. And even though we had a few people that we did know, that community was definitely lacking. And I know that my parents definitely experienced that. I'm sure, 100% sure that they definitely missed having that community and having family nearby. And so unfortunately that to a certain extent did leave us a little bit isolated from what would have been our community had we also continued to live in Mexico.
Absolutely. And that's where, again, many individuals who may be migrated to this country and might be indigenous, they may speak the language, but in order to fit in, be accepted, not be laughed at, or whatever discrimination that people experience, they allow their children, or they don't encourage their children more than anything, to learn their indigenous languages,
Mhm.
their cultural values, beliefs, norms from their ancestral people. And that's where we start losing those roots. And so eventually, like the saying as goes, ni de aquí ni de allá, we don't actually know where we belong. And that is very common, unfortunately, for those people who don't have that immediate support, that community, because then you're just in isolation. I've known people who, again, live in apartments here in Sonoma County who may be from maybe Veracruz and everybody else is from Michoacan or from other states or other countries. And the person from Veracruz has been living there, let's say 10 years in the same apartment building, and they've never developed a friendship with the other people. And that level of isolation can create such depression, such
Mhm.
anxiety, and other issues. And of course, as you know, it expands, right? From mom and dad experiencing this, and how do we transmit those emotions and those feelings to our own children? Um, so it sounds like, again, your family established themselves up there, and at some point you came to the world and you became part of the family. Um, what was the experience growing up as a U.S. citizen living with migrant or refugee family members?
Yeah, thank you so much for asking that question. I think this is one that I've had the opportunity to really reflect on, especially as I kind of look forward into the kind of work that I want to be doing. And for me, I think when you asked that question, the first thing that popped to mind, it was just my mom having a conversation with me about what I was to do if they were ever to be detained by ICE. And it was her pulling me aside and telling me, hey, if we, like both me and your dad, are to be detained, I want you to go to this friend's house. This friend's house, she has paper, she has documentation, so she would be able to take care of you. And we would reach out to her for like next steps. And so I think growing up, that was always at the front of my mind, was knowing that at any point my parents could be taken away. And that was such a huge fear, and even to this day continues to be a fear. But as a little girl, I remember the impact that that had on me, that at a very young age, I knew that I was not the same as everybody else.
Mhm.
That potentially other people just didn't have to deal with these kind of concerns and these kind of worries, because why am I a 6-year-old super concerned about something like this when in fact I should have just been given the opportunity to just be a kid? But I think the other piece to that is also, even though I went to a school like throughout my education from K through 12, even though I went through school to schools that actually had like a pretty decent Latinx population, there was still a very stark difference between us as Latinos and also compared to the white individuals there
Mhm.
too. And just noticing that, like, for example, my dad would take me to class, would take me to school, drop me off in his all white outfit because he was a painter. And that was the outfit that was required. There were just these stark differences when then I would see and look across the school that maybe another student was actually being dropped off in this really nice car and dad was dropping them off in maybe a suit. And so I think from a very young age, I knew that there was a difference between myself and then also other people who just didn't have to be concerned about these kind of things. And so I think that that lens really continued to shape how I viewed the world. And also the way that I just continued to really respect and admire the kind of sacrifices that my parents made for me, because I knew that it was not easy. And in fact, for both of my parents, they had to lose loved ones and they were never able to attend the funeral in Mexico. So I remember one time seeing my dad crying and asking him why he was crying, and he just, well, one, it is not common for men to cry in our
Mhm.
culture. But I think too, for him, it was like his grandpa had died, and he unfortunately was not able to attend the funeral. And my mom's dad also had passed away, and she didn't get to attend the funeral. So there were things like this that as I was growing up, I was starting to catch. And I was starting to realize that there was a real limitation to the things that my parents could actually do. And so I think that continued to shape who I became and who I am today.
Yeah, again, Yesterday I was on my radio show and I was saying for parents who are immigrants, refugees, who have status, don't have status, but have brown skin, it's important to create a plan just in case immigration shows up tomorrow, a month from now, whenever. And
Hmm.
I said, and for those of you who choose not to talk to your kids about this, you are eventually causing a lot of damage to those kids because the kids know what's happening. They have access to social media, they are watching TV, they may be in the background watching mom watch TV, where in the news they are telling another horrible story about immigration doing this and the other. Um, and so not talking with children about this can be extremely damaging to their mental health.
Hmm.
But we don't talk about it. Like parents don't talk about it, right? Like, es que si no les decimos, van a estar mejor. If we don't tell them, they'll be better off. It's like they don't need to worry, but they are worrying, right? And so I always find it interesting when I talk to people like yourself who, again, lived in mixed status families growing up, and they were watching and they were listening,
Hmm.
and yet, again, they couldn't do anything. And
Yeah.
sometimes that feeling of powerlessness is so unhealthy because you also often don't want to start the conversation of why are you crying out here outside the house in the backyard or in the
Yeah.
corner or whatever the situation is,
Hmm.
or why is dad drinking more often than he was? Maybe he used to drink a beer after work, but lately he's been all weekend doing this thing. Well, his dad passed away, or his mom passed away, or the grandma that really took care of him, or whatever the situation is, right? Um, and how do you explain it to a child, but at the same time, alcoholism in an unhealthy masculinity environment. I just gave a lecture about masculinity this week, and we were talking about how alcoholism and anger happen to be two behaviors that have become completely acceptable in the Latinx community for men. Um, and how that's when men can cry, can tell each other that they love each other, and so on and so forth. And the very next day, everybody has to pretend that that didn't happen, right? The toxicity that comes with it. But again, going back to how it affects children. And so I appreciate that you feel comfortable sharing about some of your experience. Because again, the other piece that you also mentioned that is important is those children that the dad says, mija or mijo, I'll take you to school today. No, I'm cool, right? Like when you're little, you're all
Yeah.
for, yeah, I want my daddy to take me to school, this, that. But when you become a teenager, I
Hmm.
don't necessarily know what your experience was like, but I've seen it far too many times where if dad has all his tools of the trade in the back of the truck, the kid is too cool to be dropped off by dad, or the same thing with the girl. And that is because, again, we have miseducated children. Those are the tools that pay for the rent, the food, and everything else. Why am I going to be ashamed of that, right? We were not rich, which is exactly why they had to migrate. But parents often also make the mistake of giving their children a better life. The life that I couldn't have, I'm going to give it to my children. And then we give them cell phones and video games and sometimes cars. And that's a mistake because they don't learn to earn things on their own. Um, but again, I'm not sure what your experience was like later on when you were in high school and college, and whether or not in your schools, in your experiences, whether or not you had healthy friends that you could talk about emotions or anything in this situation.
That's such a good question. I mean, one, I think I definitely agree that there were people who were, I think, almost ashamed of where they were coming from, which I think is incredibly interesting. And I think for me personally, I think there was maybe one time where my dad tried to kiss my cheek. And I remember that I had like pushed him away or I had said something about like, oh, like not here. But I remembered seeing the hurt that I caused him by doing that. And moving forward until I like graduated from high school, I remember being so explicitly willing to let him give me a kiss on the cheek and for me to give him a kiss on the cheek. But that was because I understood that my reactions and me being ashamed to any of that kind of stuff, it hurts our parents because that's where our parents came from. That's where they rose from.
Yeah.
And I did see kids who didn't quite understand that. And I think that that is kind of sad to see, especially given all the sacrifices that their parents made to come to the US. And in terms to answer your second part of that question, whether I had like other friends that I could talk to about, I don't think I ever did. I don't think that I ever had the opportunity to sit down and talk about like my emotions and how I was feeling, especially not surrounding my parents' immigration status or how I felt about being different from other people. Like that was not something that was really very much talked about. And I think that it was stuff that I kept all inside. And it wasn't until I actually moved out to college that all that pent up feelings and frustration with the government and just general sadness that came with all of that, that's not what, until college, that's when all of that came out. And then I think that that was a bit of a tricky situation to then navigate because I had not been socialized into talking about these kind of things. And now I had to figure out, okay, these are all the emotions that I've had for now many years, and having to come to terms with this is now something that I might want to go to a therapist to talk about or talk to my friend about. And so I think it's really interesting that you mentioned that because I think that our culture here in the US is just to ignore it and to not talk about it, even amongst like the generation that moved here, so the migrants, and also within like first generation, all the generations that follow as well.
It's interesting the amount of pain and suffering that first generation US born children carry on a daily basis.
Mm.
As somebody who teaches at a community college, it's a privilege, one, as a person of color, to be in the front of the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
And I work very hard to get this position, but also my role is to serve as an example to future generations, to the kids who just graduated high school, to the kids who are coming back to college maybe after a few years, to say, this is a safe space for you.
Yeah.
And in my classes, we talk about trauma. What is trauma? Because I teach classes relating to gangs and migration and a bunch of other pieces. But it's important. And what comes up on a regular basis are those students who stay after class and walk me back to my office. And they're like, so you think it's safe for me to go across the street and talk to a therapist?
Mm.
Yeah. Because my parents think that only crazy people go to, well, we're all
Mhm.
crazy. Believe me, we're all crazy. The fact that some of us choose not to acknowledge it is a whole different, right? And I'll engage with the students. Sometimes I'll walk them over. Sometimes I'll pick up the phone and say, I'm sending you somebody, the warm handoff type of thing. Um, and some of them don't. But the other piece here is you had the opportunity to have access to those resources, hopefully at the university level, at the college level. But how many of our Latino, Latina, Latinx youth don't actually make it to college
Mhm.
and continue to suffer in silence? And that is something that, you know, it's important.
Yes.
And if the conversation is not happening at school and the conversation is not happening at home, where is it happening? In the
Mhm.
last survey that I conducted with high school students last fall, I believe it was 8% of high school students, Latinx high school students, 8% of all of the students who participated in the survey said that they had nobody to talk to about their issues. No friends to talk to that these individuals trusted, no teachers, no high school counselors, no parents, nobody,
Mhm.
right? And so, again, what happens with those kids? Not all of them, but a good number of them start medicating, right?
Mhm.
Marijuana, alcohol, other unhealthy behaviors. And so, again, for those who don't make it to college, they just don't get the resources. And we need to do a better job simply by openly talking about what is trauma, how does it affect, why is it that what happened to me is not affecting that other person, and then what resources do we provide to the community. At Santa Rosa Junior College, where I work, they just agreed to cancel 8 Psych D therapists, interns,
Mhm.
and associates for summer 2026 and beyond. They're going to cancel the program for at least 1 year. And we used to have about 10 or 11 therapists in this college of about 17,000 students, maybe a little bit more. Um, is only going to have 2 therapists. How does that make any sense? Right?
Mhm.
And our focus, from my perspective, is on the wrong thing. So that brings me to, once you made it out of high school and decided to go to college, what career did you decide on, and what was your process to decide on your major? Maybe not a career yet, but your major.
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think one, I want to acknowledge that um, even from where I come from, I still had a great amount of privilege to have the opportunity to go to college.
Mhm.
And in this experience, I think first I was really lost because I was a first generation student. I didn't really have other people that I could look to help me. And if there were, they didn't understand my identity as a Latinx individual. So I think what I ultimately ended up doing was I went to an advisor and I said, "Hey, like I'm not really sure what I want to do. I think I want to follow law first and see where that leads me." But I just simply wasn't sure. And I remember I actually started taking law class, like law related classes, and I realized that that just wasn't my personal calling. And so I then moved on to sociology. And I did complete my BA in sociology. But even then, I felt like I was only understanding half of the picture. I wasn't understanding the other half. And that was the one that I wanted to because it would give me this holistic picture of what was actually happening in our communities. And it wasn't until then when I had a mentor who actually chose to believe in my potential when I had nothing to show for it. And I remember that she actually encouraged me to apply to a program. I'm not sure if you've heard of it, but it's called the Ronald E. McNair program.
Mhm.
And essentially, what it does is it really just accepts and mentors like first generation, low income, underrepresented students to pursue their doctoral degrees. But so I applied and I was accepted. And from there, I continued to have that mentor who kept pushing me to try new things. And around that time, I started to really put things together, like really be able to notice, like reflect on my experience. Now that I was a little removed from being in Yakima, Washington, and feeling all these things, I was able to really start to reflect and notice, like, wow, like we had no mental health resources growing up. And I remember that we used to go to the clinic and maybe we were asked, "Are you feeling sad? Are you feeling this?" But that was the extent that I had, that I didn't even know how to get help if I needed it or how to get help for other people who needed it in my community. And I started to really realize that we are so underserved, the Latinx community. And that is when I ultimately decided that I wanted to start taking some psychology classes. And around that time, I remember someone actually telling me, "Oh, like, don't do clinical psychology because clinical psychology is really hard to get into, and only the smartest people get into that." And I think it's always someone's always going to tell you don't do it. Someone will always tell you not to do it. It's too hard for you. You weren't made for that. And I think that that was kind of ingrained in my brain as someone that I wanted to prove them wrong because I wanted to represent my community. So I started taking these psychology classes, and at the end of the day, I realized, I think I'm going to try. I think I'm going to try for it. And if I don't make it, that's okay. At the very least, I tried. And moving from there, I started to really gain some understanding of the field. And I applied the last, like my senior year of undergraduate I actually applied to Berkeley and I applied to a few other schools for clinical psychology, and I got rejected. And I share that because I think a lot of people think that this path is linear, that you will not experience failure. If you were made for this, you will get in and you will never experience failure. But the fact is that you will absolutely always experience failure. And that is part of growth, right? Because how do you grow if you don't hit rock bottom once or twice? And so for me, I was faced with this really difficult decision as do I quit and not continue pursuing this, or do I try and get a job that will give me more research experience and then try again? And so ultimately, I always like to say, with the help of a lot of mentors, I decided that I actually wanted to give it another shot. And so I pursued a job that was very research oriented, and that was like what I felt would be the next good step to get me into university. And I actually stayed there for 2.5 years. And those 2.5 years were me getting more experience, but I think too, I was just afraid to fail again. And I share that again because I want to really emphasize that success is just not linear. And it also means facing some of your fears of failure. And I remember being there for the first year and the application cycle came up, and I was just like, no, I'm not ready. But I knew deep down that I was just afraid to try again and potentially fail. And then second year came around, same thing happened. And then finally it was time for the application to come around yet again. And I had a mentor who just said, you will never feel ready. You just have to apply and you have to overcome those fears. And in that moment is when I created my application, I submitted it, and now I am at UC Berkeley.
And again, that's the thing, right? Like I would say that's the other piece that often doesn't happen, that we don't have this type of conversations publicly and share about the painful rejection, right? And talk about how it felt. And that's when you hear the voice of that person who may have meant well when they say, don't try this because it's too difficult and you're not going to succeed. Oh, maybe they were right. And that's where a good number of people walk away and say, yep, I'm not meant to do this work. And that brings us back to the other piece that you referred to multiple times, and that is mentorships. Well, how can we have mentors when our parents never went to college? So it's not like they can call, oh, let me call my buddy, the psychologist over there, and he can guide you through the process. Or let me call so-and-so who, right? We don't have that. And it's not that those of us who have reached some level of success in this country, right? And I use quotes because I think it's important to recognize that having a career and enjoying your career, regardless of whether it has 2 letters after your name, is success, right? So I want to acknowledge that. And our parents coming to this country and succeeding, and by succeeding meaning giving a child like yourself the opportunity to have a better, that's success, right? That's why when you get that bachelor's degree, your parents all dressed up, hopefully, sometimes it doesn't happen, and I get that, but they show up and they cheer you on, and right? And that's where those kids sometimes put the cap and gown on their parents, because it's a group effort, right?
It is.
And again, I recognize it doesn't always happen. I also work with the kids that mom is telling them, salte del colegio y vete a trabajar, right? Like leave college and go to work. That's never going to make you this and that. I work with both groups.
Mhm.
But I think it's important to recognize that a lot of people who could have become doctors in medicine, surgeons, psychiatrists, sociologists, social workers, whatever other career, judges, and so on and so forth, didn't achieve that goal because they didn't have a mentor who said, listen,
Mhm.
it's okay, take a minute, and we're going to try again, right? And that is the difference. And that's why we have to become the cheerleaders for those students, right? The student that
Mhm.
comes into my class and says, oh, it's going to take me a little bit longer because I have a disability with understanding the message, this, that. Can I record the thing? Or I need somebody to help me take notes or whatever. Hey, whatever we can do, right?
Yeah.
That's our job. At the end of the day, for those of us in education, our number one responsibility is create healthy, safe, welcoming, equitable spaces, right? So that if this student needs an additional 10 minutes to get the material versus this one who already got it, we're going
Mhm.
to come up with the 10 minutes because that's what equity looks like. But ultimately, it's about those mentors. And not many of us had mentors.
No, and I think that that is also why I always recognize the privilege of having those mentors. And even when I think back about like on those mentors, none of those look like me. None of them were Latinx. And I was always, even though I had that mentorship, and I, of course, always appreciate it, there was always a slight lack of understanding from them. Like they didn't fully understand all the barriers that I had to overcome and that I would have to overcome in order to pursue any kind of career. I think that that is the other piece here is that now when people like myself and people like my current advisor here at UC Berkeley are Latinx, it is our responsibility to extend the hand to the generation that's upcoming and pull them up with us. Because otherwise, then they're left with no mentors, or maybe mentors who just simply don't understand their experience and how their identity impacts that as well.
Absolutely. And there are people out there who want to become mentors to Latinx community members. And again, they just don't understand the cultural pieces.
Mhm.
Well, we're going to go over the weekend and we are going to go to this conference. No, my mom says I have to be home by a certain time.
Mhm.
What are you talking about? Right? Or, no, my parents don't understand that I have to study for this midterm or this final because we are supposed to go to this religious event or this, family gathering or this village equivalent gathering that happens once every year, or right. And they're like, well, just tell them no, that you have to do this. Like, it doesn't work, right? So it's one of those things. It's like in my years of doing this, not necessarily in the classroom, but my previous work as an outreach coordinator, and just community advocacy, how many times it's like, yeah, señora, no, I understand. Yeah, you have this personal family thing that you want to do, and this trip is super important to you, but let's have a conversation about what is best for your child, right?
Mhm.
And convincing the parents that this trip to San Diego it's important, or that trip to Sacramento is important, or that simply your student needs to stay at the college and study until 10 p.m. rather than go home and cook and clean and all of this stuff. And so, I myself had three mentors that were women, white, all of them. Miss Mari Hotaling, who was the woman who would give up her lunches at Santa Rosa High School to practice English pronunciation. In fact, I would speak in English and she would practice her Spanish. Um, and I moved later on from Sonoma County. I came back when I was already in college, and for several years, our relationship was so healthy, and we would just go to lunch once in a while. Even
Mm-hmm.
after I became a professional, we would still go to lunch once in a while because she had been there, right? She
Yeah.
didn't necessarily understand everything about my culture, but she was there.
Yeah.
And then, what is it called? Kathleen Cummings, the woman at Santa Rosa Junior College who gave me my first job as a college student, right? And
Mm-hmm.
it became from being my supervisor to being that caretaker who I remember said, no, 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 you're done at the JC. You now need to apply for the university. I don't think I'm ready, right? No, you're going to bring me evidence. In fact, you know what? Let me call so and so. And she picked up the phone and she called the counselor. I forget her name now. And she said, okay, she's waiting for you. And I remember I walked in there. This is hundreds of years ago. So we did everything on paper. And so she's like, sign here, put your name here, blah, blah, blah. Okay, I'll send it for you. And they're like, so what's next? Well, next is orientation at Sonoma State because that's it. You have a guaranteed acceptance. Your grades are good. Your major is good, blah, blah, blah.
Mm-hmm.
And the last woman, there have been other women, so in case they're listening to this at some point, don't be offended. But another woman that was a great mentor for me was Marianne Michaels, another white individual. She became my first supervisor as a professional at Santa Rosa Junior College, and she was so compassionate,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And we started eventually what I would call the Friday night club because at the end of Friday afternoon, everybody would go home in the office and she would stay in her office and I would stay working in my office. And at some point she would come in and she's like, so how's everything? And we would just sit down and chit chat and she would give me feedback and I would give her ideas. And it was just that healthy of a relationship, right? And so we all need mentors.
Mm-hmm.
But the other piece, and I don't know what your experience has been, that sometimes our own Latinx professionals who should be mentoring create um, challenges, difficulties, problems for the incoming first generation college students. No, 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 I did it on my own, and we're going to make it as hard as possible for you. And I've seen that too, right? So it's important for people who are getting this information to not assume that just because somebody out there, a professor or a professional who has brown skin, is always going to be a welcoming person, because maybe they are still dealing with their own unresolved issues and they're passing that on to you. And what I would say to those young people who are going through those experiences is don't give up. Just keep looking for somebody else because there's always somebody else, and they don't have to be Latinx who are willing to support. Some
Mm-hmm.
of them are eager to learn about your culture to do a better job as a mentor. Not everybody is. But again, we need those mentors. And I'm so glad that you and your advisor over there at UC Berkeley are already not just sitting out there in the ivory towers, as we like to call them, but going out into the community and sharing your knowledge with everybody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think you make such great points. I think whenever I have a mentee that I'm working with, I always say, like, you have to ensure that whoever you are working with aligns with the values that you have. And that is such a key thing. So, like you said, just because I may have brown skin does not mean that my values align with yours.
Mhm.
So, being very, in Spanish, the word is discernimiento. Having that discernment is so important. And then using your values to guide it. And so, I think that when I was looking for a mentor for graduate school, I was looking for someone who also had that piece who had the same values that I did, and that was community, helping others, being empathetic, being compassionate where we can, and also recognizing our downfalls because we're all human at the end of the day, and actively working to address them in a healthy manner. And so for me, I was looking for someone who was willing to step out of that ivory tower and go down to where we came from to help others and bring them up to the tower. And thankfully, I did find a mentor who also had those values. But yeah, I think you make such great points about that as well. And I think we try as much as we can to go out into the community. And I think that at the end of the day, that is the kind of work that actually gives, speaking for myself, my work meaning.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So that definitely takes us to the next point. You have a logo behind you and you have this entrance, the famous gate. UC Berkeley, what is happening with you at UC Berkeley? What work are you doing today? And how will this support this specific, not just the Latinx community, of course, but specifically the area of study that you're focused on?
Yeah, so I know that I've already shared a few bits and pieces about my story, but that's all just to say that who I am, how I was raised, all really informed the kind of work that I wanted to do. And I know I had mentioned earlier that I had started to see this lack of mental health resources within my community. So I really wanted to find a way where I could close that gap, where all the resources, all the research that said, hey, this intervention, this treatment, it works, would actually reach the people who needed it the most. And I decided then to move into a space where I was increasing access not only to the Latinx community, but also to all racial and ethnic minoritized individuals, just increasing that access to mental health services and resources. And so that's a lot of the work that I'm doing here at UC Berkeley. And I like to think about the work that I do within like 3 branches. So the first one is really seeking ways where we can take treatments, we can take interventions and services, and then culturally adapt them for the communities that need them. Because sometimes the services that are out there, maybe they do work, but they don't work as well for our community. And that's just because they're not matching the values of our community, right? They're not taking into account maybe our language, the way that we communicate, the way that we cherish family, and the way that we value certain things. And so that piece is just really taking these interventions and, if need be, culturally adapting them so that they better fit the needs of our community. The second piece that I kind of work on, or the second branch that I would like to say, is really leveraging digital tools. So digital tools really could be things like applications, they could be websites, they could be anything that involves with digital, like web-based work. And for that piece, it's one of the ways where I feel like I can really increase access, because a lot of the individuals in our community have access to a phone. And maybe they don't have internet at home, maybe they don't have a laptop, but a lot of them do have a phone because that's how they communicate with people in Mexico. They use the WhatsApp and all of that. And so I think that is an incredibly promising avenue to being able to reach other individuals. And I think the last kind of branch of my work really involves including the community in that work. Because who am I to dictate the kind of things that my community needs? Just because I'm Latinx does not mean that I know what everybody in my community needs. No, I am just but one experience, one side of the penny of what our community actually needs. And so for that last piece, it's incredibly important for me to integrate voices of the community who have different experiences, that diversity piece. Maybe we have first gen, maybe we have migrants, maybe we have the grandma, the abuelita, who have their own experiences, who have their own opinions, and integrating that into my work. Maybe I approach them and I say, hey, is this application something you would use? If they say no, okay, tell me why. And making then changes to that application, trying again. And so I think that a lot of the times we fail to incorporate the communities that we want to help into our work. And that is something that I think one is an issue for our field, but two is something that I just really strive to incorporate the community. So that's a little bit of the work that I'm doing here at UC Berkeley.
Thank you for that. I think that it is sadly somewhat common for government agencies and sometimes other institutional agencies, whether it is universities, to almost come with this savior's complex of,
Mhm.
hey, we created this app and you're going to use it and all of your life problems will be over. And it's like, okay, but this and this and this doesn't apply to me.
Mhm.
Oh, okay. Well, it's your problem rather than it's our problem. And we should have asked you for input before we created this app.
Mhm.
And recently, your advisor, and I, I apologize, I didn't notice if your name was attached to that research, but it was about specifically how there's over 700 or so apps that supposedly are for mental health, but in reality, we have to be cautious about what works, what doesn't work, what was designed by people who know about mental health, and what is not, because we don't want to cause more problems for our community by the fact that you may be using an app that has zero clinical type of knowledge input to be able to work with you. And we know the consequences sometimes of people using bots in order to be able to try and heal from your mental health or cope, if nothing else. UNAM just released uh, an article last week where they were talking about how a lot of people who use ChatGPT or similar apps to try and cope with their mental health issues, the only accomplishment that happens is they tend to isolate even more and only interact with the app rather than going to family, friends, and professionals. And this is where some people end up taking their own lives. Again, so it's important that we get research from institutions like the one where you are that are based on information that is culturally competent and
Mhm.
that is coming to a certain degree from the people who are going to best benefit from that information. And so I appreciate the work that you're doing there. So that brings me to the other question in regards to your education. So you are now doing this research, but how long ago did you start the PhD?
Yeah, that's such a great question. So I'm actually coming up to my first year in this program, and so I have about four left. So still a long road ahead.
Good. And again, you happen to be in what the Chinese has determined to be the most prestigious public university in the world, UC Berkeley. You came from Washington. What is it like, the experience being at this prestigious university that obviously has its ups and downs from time to time? But what has the experience been like?
That's such a great question. I think at first it can be a little jarring because this is just not the environment in which I was raised and the environment that I was used to. And even though I did go to a university in undergrad, I think this is a different level, right? So you can think about it as this kind of pyramid. And the further that you go up in education, the less people will look like us or will understand our experiences. And so even in college, like I looked around and I still saw a few here and there that looked like me and who I could connect with and who to a certain extent I could feel heard and understood. But the more that I came up in this in just in education, the less I started to see. And so now actually there are maybe aside from my mentor, I think in total in this department, or I would say in this specific area, there are only three of us who are Latinx, one of whom is graduating. And at which point I will be the only Latinx student in this specific area in clinical psychology at this university. So as you can imagine, it can feel a little lonely sometimes. And I think that only fuels my resolve to extend hands to others who are interested in this and to bring them up with me, because I think that we cannot do this work alone, and we need to lean on our community to be able to do the work that is very much necessary. But yeah, I think it has been both being a little lonely sometimes and seeing like, oh, people don't quite understand where I'm coming from. But also, I think that that really fuels my resolve to move forward and to push forward, because this field needs more people who are speaking up for our community and who are integrating them into the work that we do.
It's interesting, right? The prestigious university and the lack of diversity from that point. California has something like 40% of the population or 50% of the population of California are Latino, Latina, Latinx. And it's important, again, for people to understand that when we use Latinx, for me at least, it means including the people from Latin America, but that means including the indigenous part and
Mm-hmm.
the African ancestry as a result of slavery. And so we are all very diverse within that umbrella.
Mm-hmm.
But again, that's important, that this prestigious university doesn't have enough diversity to be able to provide services to almost half of its population who happen
Mm-hmm.
to either born in the US from Latinx families or people who migrated. I think that is a conversation that needs to be had at some point, and not just be grateful of, oh, I'm one of two or I'm one of three. I'm so good that I made it here. But where's
Mm-mm.
the rest of the people,
Mm-hmm.
right? And
Yep.
that's the conversation that often is not had in this environment.
And I think the other piece that I also wanted to mention is also just the being able to look around, and there are people who are not, who have the resources to get the textbooks that they need, who have the resources, who have nice living places, who live maybe nearby. And I think for me, that is not a luxury that I have. And I think that that is the other thing, because sometimes there are students who come in and maybe, yes, you made it, and you had been given the opportunity and been afforded mentors who have gotten you this far. But now you're in a place where you're the one, and maybe the only one, who's struggling to make it through. Maybe the only one who's still struggling to get food and go to school. And so there are like, I feel like the fighting never really stops. We're fighting to represent our community, but at the same time, we're still facing a lot of barriers that our community currently faces. And so I think that is the other piece, is that, yeah, it feels lonely because we're not overcoming the same barriers. Sometimes we're overcoming many more than our colleagues, than our classmates, than other people in this program. And so I think that that is also another important thing.
Absolutely. And this idea of, hey, you made it to Berkeley, you should be grateful, don't complain,
Mm-hmm.
rather than, okay, you made it to Berkeley, what other resources can we make available to you in
Mm-hmm.
order for you to go out into the world and have that sweatshirt that clearly says UC Berkeley and be proud of it, and that the institution itself is proud because they gave you all of the resources you needed. I took a group of MECHA students to UC Berkeley, maybe, yeah, last fall, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And we had that conversation with first generation students, Latinx students at Berkeley. And yeah, it, like somebody said, I live 2 hours away and I have to, commute every day. Somebody said, I used to live a few hours away and I used to commute my first year. And then I have to have a conversation with my parents that I actually needed to stay on campus because I was wasting so much time commuting that I wasn't getting my homework done, studying, and all this and all that. But how did that affect the cost of attending UC Berkeley? and friendships, and the fact that sometimes, because it's Berkeley, depending on the major and the career that you're pursuing, it can be super competitive. And instead of saying, let's create a group, a study group to help each other succeed, is more like, I get to have tutoring, private tutoring for those who can afford it. And then here you are trying to do your own studying at 3 in the morning, and maybe watching a video to try and understand the material, because you do not have the privilege to go to tutoring, even if the university offers it, because you also have to work after your classes and so on and so forth. And so for our communities, getting that college diploma, whether it is from Berkeley or again, maybe another university, once you get it, it's about celebrating, like huge celebration, because the sacrifices that went into getting this piece of paper, right? And again, sometimes when you're applying for that master's or PhD, people are like, oh, you graduated from there? Like, you don't
Hmm.
know what it took to get to this level, right? Because some people are not conscious of how challenging it can be for other community members. Same thing is sometimes when you're applying for work, a specific career, and they're like, well, that person and that person and that person went to, again, the UC system, but you went to a CSU system. Why should we give you the opportunity, right? And so it creates many more barriers sometimes, not just while you're in college, but after college, in you being able to find a good career that is going to provide you that opportunity to enjoy your life, right? Weekends and so on and so forth. And so I'm really grateful that you have chosen a career that often is minimized by moms, Latina moms, who say, oh, solo los locos van a esos lugares, right? I don't know what your parents told you when you decided to pursue this PhD. I'm sure they were super supportive and all of the stuff. But I've also, again, I mentor a lot of students who are Latinx and who want to pursue careers as social workers, therapists, psychologists, all that stuff. And the parents are like, no, 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 go become a nurse. That's where the money is. Don't do this crazy career because, right? So, and you have the right to not share with us what your parents said. But again, it's important to understand that you have chosen to contribute to society with your research and the knowledge that you're acquiring as you get your PhD.
No, it made me laugh because that is exactly what my dad told me the very first time that I shared with him. Just in psychology, like just shared psychology itself. Because at the time I wasn't really wanting to pursue it yet. But the very first time that I even brought the subject up, that's exactly what he said. Ahí van los locos.
Yeah.
And it has taken, I think, a lot of years of me being non-judgmental about it and understanding that this is the stigma that is in our community, and also educating him about psychology and therapy and treatment and what it ultimately is. That I think now he's at a point where he 100% accepts it and he is very supportive. But yeah, I agree. That is definitely something that parents can say, especially in our culture. But I think that sometimes it takes us pushing through those comments to really get to the other side. And I think the other piece that I wanted to go back to was this piece of educating, right? Because us, especially when I think about like other first generation students, right? We are that bridge. We are the bridge between the world here and the world over there.
Yep.
And I think that when we're given the opportunity to go and learn about maybe psychology and mental health services, I think it is our responsibility to then pass that on to individuals who didn't get the opportunity to learn about all this. And so being able to say, hey, Dad, actually, that's not, in fact, where only the crazy people go. That is actually where people like your uncle or maybe your dad or this, like people who have like they're just common day people who actually also need these services. I think that it's so important to be able to educate them on this subject. And only then do I think can our community truly continue to move forward, and where we can start talking about how to access mental health services. And I think that that's why it's so important for there to be things like this podcast where we're talking about these stigmas and where we're talking about how difficult it is to get education on this and pursue maybe mental health careers, because it's actually one of those stepping stones to being able to address the stigma that is in our community as well.
Absolutely. And the healing will happen not just in therapy rooms, but the
Mm-hmm.
healing can happen at the dinner table. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes is one of those conversations where you're talking about one thing and somebody makes a comment, and so you address the comment, and everybody goes quiet at the table for a second. But 2, 3, 5 days later, or even a month later, it's like, thank you for that. I learned something new, right? And it changes the relationship sometimes with our parents.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't have the privilege to grow up with my parents beyond the age of 15 um, because of migration. But again, for those people who have their parents at home, again, it can be extremely difficult challenging your dad or your mom on a specific view, but there are ways to do so. And one of the things that I tell people, especially with psychology, when parents say, solo los locos van ahí, and they're like, you know, when we talk about curanderismo, I say, and what medicinal plant do you use in a tea for headaches or for to help with diabetes and this and that? And the parents often are able to say, well, I use manzanilla for this, and I use this for this, and this. That's healing, and that's ancestral healing. And I then I continue by saying, but our people used to go to therapists. We used to call them señores and señoras, and they're still alive, those people. These were just healthy spaces where if you were having problems with your wife or your husband or your partner, or you lost a baby in pregnancy and you haven't learned to cope, I will always remember the one and only Lila Downs when she went to a morning show in Mexico, and part of the discussion was when she lost her voice.
Mm-hmm.
And for those people who don't know, look it up. But Lila Downs is super famous in Latin America. I don't know if anybody else has called her that, but after Mercedes Sosa passed away, Mercedes Sosa was known as the voice of Latin America. Ask your parents. But Lila Downs became the voice of Latin America. And if nobody else told you, I just told you. And so I declared Lila Downs the voice of Latin America. And so she goes to this show and she opens up about the time as a famous singer where she lost her voice. And she's a US citizen and she's a Mexican citizen. She may even have citizenship in Europe at the same time. And so she came to the US and she talked to these experts and they did all these tests, and right, thousands and thousands of dollars later, nothing. Her voice is not back. She's talking, she just cannot sing.
Mm-hmm.
And after all these studies, they don't know what it is. And so one day she's at home in Oaxaca, and one of the ladies that comes and cleans at her house said, why don't you go with La Señora, with the lady down the street, and just see what she can do for you?
Mm-hmm.
And she says, I hesitated. I've gone to the best of the best experts, doctors and surgeons, and everybody talked to me. You want me to go down the street to this lady? What are you talking about? But she said, I went. The next day I went, and she said, I came into her house. She told me to sit down. She brought some tea, and she poured some tea, and I had some tea, and she had some tea. And I finished my tea. And so she poured some more tea and more tea. And she didn't say anything. She says it was becoming a little bit uncomfortable. But the tea that she had given me allowed me to lower my guard and for
Mm,
me to become comfortable with speaking about my emotions.
mm,
And she says, she finally was ready and she said, well, tell me, why are you here?
mm,
And then she began crying and crying and crying. And the
mhm,
woman poured more tea. And she says, I cried for a long time and I talk about this and that, unresolved issues in her life, childhood issues, identity issues, so on and so forth. And about an hour into it, the lady says, okay, well, you can go home. And she's like, what's next? That's it. Go home. Right? Here, some people need to go to therapy weekly for months or possibly years. Curanderos, curanderas, señores and señoras typically do a one session thing, but it's a combination of these beautiful herbs I will not mention here because we train and we teach people this. I teach this in my Latin American and Caribbean class. But I also don't want listeners to suddenly go and brag about, and I always say this in my classes, don't go tomorrow and say that you now are an expert on this stuff. I've been doing this a long time. I'm nowhere close to ever becoming an expert. And so the next day, she wakes up and she says she has beautiful long hair that reaches all the way to her hips. And she says, I sat there, I woke up the next morning, I sat there in front of this beautiful mirror and I started brushing my hair.
mm,
And as I started brushing my hair, she says, I started singing.
mm,
My voice was never gone. I was just suffering from so much pain that I couldn't get it all out. And
mhm,
so when some parents out there tell me, no, 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 I'm not going to send my child to therapy, I tell them that story, and typically it helps them understand that we have been practicing the equivalent of therapy since forever, over 1,000 years now. But somebody told us that that wasn't a healthy thing to do. And so when you get that PhD and you do your research and you go to a group of 1,000 Latino, Latina, Latinx parents, right?
mhm.
They will listen to you. One, because you have the research to back you up, but two, because if they trust something, is those letters behind your name. And if you are a doctor, Yasmin, then that brings that credibility. And all the headaches that you're going to have between now and that PhD, and all that hatred that you're going to get from the haters in the world, it's all going to be worth it, right? And for those of us who are watching from the sidelines, it's important to know that we will be your cheerleaders, and we will be here as many times as you want to come over and tell us about the research you're doing with your mentor over there at UC Berkeley, because we all need to learn how to have this type of conversations about mental health,
Mhm.
about the fact that it's okay to not be okay, but it's not okay to not do something about it, right? And so I think I want to thank you for again taking the time and coming over and beginning this conversation where eventually your mentor will also hopefully join us in a few months and talk about his experience of choosing to pursue these degrees. Um, but again, keep coming back, keep updating us, give us tips on how we can better ourselves every day, because that matters.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been an honor and a pleasure to be able to talk about who I am, where I came from, and my work, and how I hope to impact our community. And as always, would love to continue being involved with your organizations and the work that you're doing because I may be doing the research, but I also recognize that you and your organization, everyone who is providing mental health services, they're actually doing the work on the ground. So they're the people that I need to move forward. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you again, Yasmin, for taking the time and being with us here at Chisme is Life, which is a program of Líderes del Futuro. And I think it's important, again, this type of chisme is good chisme. We always get to share tools, information, and hopefully guide people who in this situation want to pursue a PhD in psychology and do the research that therapists and other individuals need in order to do their jobs better. So with that, again, we want to thank you, Yasmin Landa, for visiting with us all the way from UC Berkeley, this prestigious institution, in order to, again, share with us a little bit about your story. And we look forward to our next conversation. Thank you for your time.
Perfect. Thank you so much.